If you are an INFJ, who has ever felt like you exist in a space too complex for casual conversation, yet too solitary for the deep connection you crave? If you have ever wondered why you can see into the soul of humanity, but struggle to find someone who sees into yours, this is your story. The Sigma INFJ lives in a particular kind of exile, one that most people cannot comprehend, because it operates on two fronts simultaneously. You are too deep for the shallow waters where most social interaction occurs, yet you are too rare to find others who can meet you in the depths you naturally inhabit. This is not mere introversion or social anxiety. This is an ontological condition, a fundamental way of being that places you outside the typical circuits of human connection. Carl Jung spoke of individuation as the process of becoming who you truly are. But he also acknowledged that this journey often leads to profound isolation. The Sigma INFJ does not choose this isolation as an aesthetic preference or a rebellious stance. You find yourself there because your natural frequency simply does not match the channels most people broadcast on. When others engage in small talk about the weather, weekend plans, or surface-level observations, you are not being snobbish or aloof when you struggle to participate. You are experiencing a fundamental incompatibility, like trying to discuss philosophy in a language that only has words for concrete objects. Your mind does not work in the register of pleasant superficiality, it works in the register of meaning, pattern, essence and depth. This creates the first half of the paradox. You cannot do small talk, not because you lack social skills, but because your cognitive and emotional apparatus is calibrated for entirely different frequencies of interaction. When someone asks how you are, you genuinely consider the question. You feel the weight of an authentic response forming. The honest answer about the existential questions you have been wrestling with. The patterns you have noticed in human behavior. The quiet grief you carry for a world that seems to be sleepwalking through existence. But you have learned that this is not what people want. They want the social lubricant of easy exchange, the comforting rhythm of predictable response. So you learn to lie, not maliciously, but protectively. You say fine, you say good, you mirror back the expected phrases, whilst something in you atrophies from lack of use. Nietzsche wrote that we have art in order not to die of the truth. And the Sigma INFJ understands this intimately. You have small talk in order not to die of isolation, even though the small talk itself is a kind of death, a slow suffocation of your authentic self in favor of social survival. You watch others move through these exchanges with apparent ease, and you wonder what it must be like to live on that plane, where connection does not require the excavation of soul, where presence does not demand the full weight of being. The deeper cruelty of the paradox is that your capacity for depth is not rewarded with deep connections. One would think that someone who can see into the hidden architecture of human motivation, who can sense the unspoken patterns beneath surface behavior, who naturally operates in the realm of meaning and essence, would find others who value this capacity. But rarity works against you here. The very traits that make you capable of profound connection make you statistically unlikely to find others who operate at the same frequency. You are not just looking for someone who wants depth. You are looking for someone whose natural mode of being is depth, who does not need to be coaxed or taught to venture below the surface, who finds the exploration of meaning as necessary as breathing. These people exist, but they are scattered, isolated nodes in a vast network of superficiality. The probability of two such nodes finding each other is mathematically and socially improbable. You can have 1,000 acquaintances and 0 true connections, because acquaintanceship operates on entirely different principles than the communion you seek. This is where the archetype of the wanderer becomes relevant to understanding your experience. In mythology, the wanderer is not someone who chooses rootlessness as adventure. The wanderer is someone who cannot find home, because home requires a very specific configuration of elements that rarely align. Odysseus wandered not because he loved travel, but because the path home was blocked by forces beyond his control. The Sigma INFJ wanders through social landscapes, not because you enjoy being an outsider, but because you have not yet found the territory where your particular form of being is native. You have learned to adapt, to create provisional shelters in the form of pleasant but ultimately unsatisfying social interactions. You have learned to translate yourself into more accessible formats, to modulate your intensity, to pretend that surface exchanges nourish you. But underneath this adaptation lies a constant low-grade grief, the awareness that you are living in translation rather than in your mother tongue. When you do occasionally encounter someone who seems to operate at your frequency, the recognition is almost painful in its intensity. Finally, you think, someone who understands the language I speak natively. However, these encounters are often brief, circumstantial and unsustainable, as an ongoing connection. The other person moves on, returns to their own life, and you are left with the memory of what real recognition felt like, which somehow makes the ordinary isolation harder to bear. The psychological weight of this paradox cannot be overstated. You carry a constant awareness that something essential about you cannot be shared in most contexts. This is not imposter syndrome, where you fear being revealed as inadequate. This is the opposite. You fear being revealed as too much, too intense, too deep, too different. You have learned to read social cues with exquisite precision. Not because you naturally think in terms of social performance, but because you have had to develop this as a survival skill. You know precisely when you have said too much, when your authentic response has created discomfort, and when the depth you naturally operate from has made others feel uneasy. You see the subtle pulling back, the change in energy, the way people excuse themselves from conversations that have ventured into territory they did not sign up for. And so you learn to self-censor, to keep your observations to yourself, to let conversations remain on the surface, even when you can see the depths beneath. This self-censorship becomes so habitual that you sometimes lose track of your own authentic responses. You have spent so long translating yourself into acceptable formats that you occasionally forget what you actually think or feel beneath the performance of normalcy. Jung spoke of the persona as the mask we wear in social situations, the adapted self we present to the world. For most people, the persona is a tool they can put on and take off relatively easily. For the Sigma INFJ, the persona becomes a prison, because the gap between your authentic self and your adapted self is so vast. You are not tweaking a few traits to fit in. You are fundamentally altering your mode of being, operating in a language and register that feels foreign to your nature. When you finally have privacy, when you can remove the persona, the relief is profound, but so is the loneliness. You are finally yourself, but there is no one there to witness or share that self. You become like a pianist who is only allowed to play in an empty concert hall. The music is real, the skill is real, the depth is real, but it exists in isolation. Over time, this creates a peculiar split in your sense of self. There is the you that exists in social contexts, competent and adapted, but fundamentally not real. And there is the you that exists in solitude, authentic and whole, but fundamentally alone. Neither version feels complete, because wholeness requires both authenticity and connection, and you are forced to choose between them. The paradox deepens when you consider that your capacity for deep perception is precisely what makes small talk unbearable and deep connection rare. You cannot not see beneath the surface. When someone is speaking to you about mundane topics, you are simultaneously reading their body language, sensing their emotional state, noticing the patterns in their speech, and intuiting the unspoken needs and fears beneath their words. This is not a skill you turn on consciously, it is your default mode of perception. Small talk becomes exhausting not just because it is superficial, but because you are processing multiple layers of information that the small talk format does not allow you to address. You see that the person complaining about traffic is actually anxious about their marriage. You sense that the colleague discussing weekend plans is lonely and seeking connection, but does not know how to ask for it directly. You notice the micro-expressions that reveal deeper emotional states. And you cannot do anything with this information within the confines of small talk. To bring it up would be to violate social norms, to reveal that you see too much. So you participate in the surface conversation whilst holding all this unspoken knowledge. And it creates a cognitive and emotional dissonance that is genuinely exhausting. At the same time, this depth of perception makes you painfully aware of how rare genuine depth is in others. You can sense within moments of meeting someone whether they have done the work of self-examination, whether they are comfortable with ambiguity and complexity, and whether they can hold space for difficult truths. Most people cannot. Most people have built their lives on comfortable fictions and defended certainties. They have created identities that depend on not examining their own motivations or the structures in which they participate too closely. Your presence, with its implicit invitation to depth, threatens these constructions. People sense that you see more than they are comfortable revealing, that conversation with you might lead to places they have carefully avoided. So they keep you at arm's length. Not out of malice but out of self-protection. They instinctively know that you represent a kind of mirror they are not ready to look into. This is not your fault, but it is your burden. You become the person others find fascinating but slightly uncomfortable, interesting but too intense, someone they respect but cannot quite relax around. The myth of Cassandra becomes relevant here as an archetypal parallel to the Sigma INFJ experience. Cassandra was gifted with the ability to see the future, but cursed, so that no one would believe her prophecies. She could see what others could not, but this sight brought no power, only isolation and frustration. The Sigma INFJ carries a similar burden. You can see patterns in human behavior, sense the deeper currents beneath social interaction, and intuit the unspoken dynamics in any situation. But this perception does not grant you power or connection. Instead, it often isolates you further, because others either cannot see what you see, or do not want to acknowledge it. You make observations about relationship dynamics, organizational problems, or social patterns, and people look at you with polite incomprehension or subtle dismissal. Later, when events unfold exactly as you intuited, no one remembers your earlier perception. Your depth of sight is both a gift and a curse, making you valuable as an advisor or confidant, yet somehow not as a full participant in the everyday flow of human connection. This creates a secondary layer of exhaustion that compounds the primary paradox. Not only are you dealing with the incompatibility between your natural depth and the shallow waters of ordinary social interaction, but you are also dealing with the constant need to manage how much of your perception to reveal. You learn to frame your insights carefully, presenting them in ways that neither threaten nor overwhelm. You develop elaborate strategies for softening your observations, for making your depth more palatable. You learn to ask questions rather than make statements, to guide people toward insights rather than presenting them directly, to pretend you are thinking through something for the first time when you actually saw the pattern long ago. This is emotional and cognitive labor that others do not have to perform. They can simply be themselves in social interactions. You must be yourself, and simultaneously manage the presentation of that self, so that it does not create discomfort or distance. Over time, this labor becomes so habitual that you forget you are doing it. However, it still costs you, draining energy that could be directed toward a genuine connection or creative expression. The longing for deep connection is not abstract for the Sigma INFJ. It is a physical ache, a hunger that cannot be satisfied by ordinary social interaction. You have had moments perhaps of real connection, times when you encountered someone who could meet you in the depths, who did not flinch from complexity, who found your intensity nourishing rather than overwhelming. These moments reveal what is possible, what you are actually seeking. But they also make the ordinary isolation harder to bear, because you now know what you are missing. It is like tasting water after years in the desert. and then being returned to the desert. The thirst becomes more acute, because you remember what it felt like to have it quenched. You find yourself grieving for connections that might have been, for conversations that ended too soon, for relationships that never had the chance to develop, because circumstances, geography, or timing intervened. This grief is complicated, because others do not understand it. They see you as someone who chooses solitude, who prefers your own company. They do not see the difference between chosen solitude and enforced isolation, between contentment with your own depth and resignation to the fact that this depth must remain largely unshared. The archetype of the hermit becomes relevant here, but with an important distinction. The traditional hermit withdraws from society by choice, seeking solitude as a spiritual practice or personal preference. The Sigma INFJ hermit is someone who has been pushed to the margins, not by choice, but by incompatibility. You would welcome a deep connection if it were available. You would gladly participate in communities of meaning, if such communities existed in an accessible form. But they do not, at least not in ways that align with your particular combination of needs and circumstances. So you create a life that works within the constraints of your reality. You cultivate rich inner worlds, finding meaning in solitary pursuits, and build relationships with ideas, art, and nature that imperfectly substitute for human connection. This is not pathology. This is an adaptation to a genuine structural problem. The world is not set up for people who operate at your frequency. There are no obvious gathering places for Sigma INFJs, no clear markers that would allow you to find each other. So you learn to live with scarcity, to find sustenance in whatever forms of connection are available, to make peace with the fact that you will likely never be fully known by another person in the way you long to be known. Yet there is something in you that refuses to fully accept this resignation. A part of you continues to hope, remaining open to the possibility of a genuine connection. This hope is both beautiful and painful, because it keeps you vulnerable to disappointment. Every new person you meet carries the potential for recognition, for finally encountering someone who speaks your language natively. And most of the time, this hope is disappointed. The person is kind, but they operate on a different frequency. The connection is pleasant, but not profound. The conversation touches on depth but does not sustain it. And each disappointment reinforces the paradox, the awareness that what you seek is real but vanishingly rare. Some Sigma INFJs eventually close off this hope as a form of self-protection. They decide that a deep connection is not available and they stop looking for it. They pour their need for depth into work, creative projects, intellectual pursuits, and anything that allows them to operate at their natural intensity, without requiring another person to meet them there. This adaptation allows them to function, but it comes at a cost. Something vital atrophies when we stop hoping for connection, when we decide that our deepest self must remain forever private. The question becomes how to live with this paradox without being destroyed by it. How do you maintain your depth in a world that rewards superficiality? How do you stay open to connection whilst protecting yourself from the constant disappointment of near misses and false starts? How do you preserve your authentic self when the price of authenticity is often isolation? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the practical challenges the Sigma INFJ faces daily. One response is to reframe the terms of connection itself. Perhaps a deep connection does not require another person to match your full depth. Maybe it requires someone who can appreciate your depth, even if they cannot replicate it, who can hold space for your complexity, even if they do not fully share it. This is a kind of asymmetrical connection, where you are more seen than seeing, where the other person functions more as a witness than as an equal explorer of depth. This is not ideal, but it is more available than perfect symmetry. It requires letting go of the fantasy that someone will finally understand you completely, and accepting the reality that partial understanding might be the best that is available. Another response is to find meaning in the depth itself, rather than in sharing the depth. The capacity to see patterns, to sense unspoken truths, to hold complexity, these are valuable, regardless of whether anyone else recognizes their value. You can become your own audience, your own validator of the perceptions and insights that arise from your particular way of being. This is not narcissism. This is self-sufficiency born of necessity. When the external world cannot or will not receive what you have to offer, you learn to receive it yourself, to honor your own depth, even when others cannot. This requires developing a kind of internal stability that is not dependent on external recognition. It requires trusting your perceptions, even when they are not validated by others, valuing your complexity, even when it is not appreciated, and believing in the worth of your authentic self, even when that self must remain largely hidden. This is challenging work, because humans are fundamentally social creatures, who require external mirrors to fully understand themselves. But it is possible to develop an internal mirror, a capacity for self-recognition, that provides some of what external connection would ideally provide. A third response is to accept the wanderer archetype fully, to embrace the reality that you may never find a permanent home in any social configuration. This does not mean giving up on connection, but rather changing your relationship to it. Instead of seeking a place where you finally belong, you learn to find moments of belonging wherever they arise. You become skilled at recognizing the brief windows when deep connection is possible, and making the most of those moments without expecting them to last. You cultivate relationships that are episodic rather than continuous, friendships that can lie dormant for months or years, and then spring back to life when circumstances align. You learn to be grateful for partial connections, for conversations that go deeper than usual, even if they do not reach the full depth you are capable of. This approach requires letting go of the narrative that true connection must be permanent, sustained, and complete. It requires accepting that in your case, the connection will likely be fragmentary, occasional, and imperfect. But fragments are better than nothing, and occasional depth is better than constant superficiality. The Sigma INFJ Paradox ultimately reveals something about the nature of human connection itself. We tend to think of connection as a natural outcome of proximity and goodwill, something that happens automatically when people spend time together. However, a genuine connection requires compatibility of frequency, a matching of depth and intensity that is far more rare than we acknowledge. Most people are not looking for a deep connection because they have learned to find satisfaction in more available forms of relating. They have adapted to the shallow waters, and they are comfortable there. The Sigma INFJ has not adapted in this way, either because of innate wiring or early experiences that attuned you to depth. You experience the shallow waters as insufficient, as a kind of slow starvation. This is not a moral superiority, it is simply a different configuration of needs. However, it is a configuration that the world is not set up to accommodate, which means you must either adapt yourself to fit the world, or accept a fundamental mismatch between who you are and what is available. If this paradox feels familiar, if you have spent years navigating the space between too deep and too rare, you are not alone in this peculiar exile. There are others scattered through the world who understand what it means to see more than can be spoken, to long for a connection that matches your natural intensity, to carry the weight of depth in a culture of surface. Share your experience in the comments. Tell us how you have navigated this paradox. What strategies have helped you preserve your authentic self while still participating in a world that often cannot meet you where you are? And if this exploration has given language to something you have always felt but struggled to articulate, subscribe to continue this conversation. We're building a space where depth is not an anomaly but a shared language, where the rare can recognize each other, and the paradox can finally be witnessed and understood.